So if you're a leader leading a company through any of the major changes today, one of the implications is that the people who will actually need to lead the change will be the young, recently hired employees who've just come out of university. Perhaps they've not even finished university. Maybe they have been hired straight out of school. And because of their age, because they've grown up with computers, they are so ahead of anybody above the age of 30 in this technology, well, perhaps almost anybody, that they are the ones who are going to need to lead the digital transformation. They are the ones who are going to need to figure out what is the right way of defining roles, structuring the relationships between roles, structuring the organizations. And the executives of the company are going to need to follow their lead in how to structure the organization, what to actually do, what culture is needed, etc. So the whole role of leadership and followership is being turned on its head. And yet at the same time, the role of the experienced executives in leading the business forwards does not change.
Welcome, Graham. Thank you for joining me on the HR Congress podcast today. You're the founder of Evolute 6, and you speak on a wide variety of topics covering the reinvention of organizations, from new management methodologies to technology and basically everything in between.
Thank you, Ben. Glad to be here.
I want to start with a question. What are some of the things on a day-to-day basis that you're seeing in the field of changing the way organizations operate? What are some of the methodologies and ideas that are becoming more focused upon at the moment in time?
I'd like to start by saying it's important to understand what is the external business driver that is demanding some kind of reinvention of the organization before we look at what needs to be reinvented, what needs to change. For instance, if I look at history, there was a huge need to reinvent organizations. At the time, transport was shifting from horse-drawn carriages and individual people riding horses into the automobile. Initially, the petrol-powered automobiles were all built by traditional carriage makers. But if you look at today's car industry, there isn't a single traditional carriage maker that is still building cars. All of them went out of business simply because they were not able to reinvent themselves in the face of the rapid change in the technology of transport. It took somebody with the genius of Henry Ford to figure out that the future of the automobile, the future of personal transport, was in mass production of cars at a price that everybody could afford. And so he invented things like the production line. He also did things like increasing the salaries of his workers so that they could all afford to buy his cars. He recognized that there was this interrelationship across the entire system. And none of the traditional manufacturers of horse-drawn carriages were able to make that transition. So the question behind that is, why weren't they able to make that transition? And by the way, it wasn't just them. Across all massive disruptions of industries, it's extremely rare for any of the major players in the previous cycle to survive through into the next cycle. You know, how many of the industrial companies that used to make massive quantities of industrial ice, how many of them survived when refrigeration and air conditioning was developed for home consumption? None of them. The issue is we tend to look at everything as if it's a simple technical challenge, that all we need to do is change the technology that we're using or change the technique that we're using as leaders to define our strategy, to construct our organization. Sometimes the external driver is purely a technical driver. And if it's purely a technical driver, then it's enough to just take some off-the-shelf organization design, some off-the-shelf piece of technology, and plug it into our existing organization. However, if it's much bigger than just a technical challenge, if it's something that is a fundamental paradigm shift, and the shift from horse-drawn personal transport into engine-powered personal transport was a huge paradigm shift. That means that we need to change how we think. We need to change how we see the world. And in particular, anybody in a leadership position needs to change how they think. They need to change how they see the world. And especially they need to change how they see themselves and other people. And this is what's called an adaptive challenge. How do I adapt myself first and foremost? And as a business leader, then how do I adapt my culture and my organization to be fit for purpose for the new challenge coming up? Now, if I look at the changes that are already with us, and we've just seen a small fraction of the changes that are coming in the next 10 to 20 years, once artificial intelligence really starts to kick in strongly. These are going to require many, many changes that are all anchored in our capacity to adapt who we are. For example, I was running a project for some MBA students at the Solvay Business School recently. And one of the comments that came back to me was that they needed to learn through self-study almost everything that they were doing in this project, because it was all about digital technology. It was all about blockchain, how blockchain could be used to power organizations. And none of their professors are world experts at this. The world experts at this are other folk approximately their age, who are the pioneers, the practitioners. So if you're a leader leading a company through any of the major changes today, one of the implications is that the people who will actually need to lead the change will be the young, recently hired employees who've just come out of university. Perhaps they've not even finished university. Maybe they have been hired straight out of school. And because of their age, because they've grown up with computers, they are so ahead of anybody above the age of 30 in this technology, well, perhaps almost anybody, that they are the ones who are going to need to lead the digital transformation. They are the ones who are going to need to figure out what is the right way of defining roles, structuring the relationships between roles, structuring the organizations. And the executives of the company are going to need to follow their lead in how to structure the organization, what to actually do, what culture is needed, etc. So the whole role of leadership and followership is being turned on its head. And yet at the same time, the role of the experienced executives in leading the business forwards does not change. So the business leaders are still the business leaders. And this fundamental paradox is a challenge for both ends of the paradox to figure out, who am I if I'm both leading and following, especially given that there is the age and experience gap in both directions. So I see this as one of the biggest challenges for many businesses today. The business drive that is demanding change is one where we're shifting from one paradigm to another paradigm. And what that means is the organization needs to change. In most cases, this means it needs to change to some kind of an agile organization. It means using something like sociocracy, holacracy, or any of the other teal organization structures. Most people think that those are flat. Actually, they're not flat. They are extremely hierarchical, but it's a hierarchy that depends on the context, which means that in 1 minute, the young, recently hired expert in a certain aspect of digital technology may need to lead the older, well-experienced executive, and in the next minute, the roles are reversed. And this is something that requires, in particular from the older executive, a huge mindset shift. For many people, they see themselves through the lens of, I am a leader. And therefore, if I need to follow somebody who is much younger than me, that must mean there's something wrong with me as a leader, which is actually fundamentally incorrect. There's nothing wrong with somebody as a leader. What's wrong is the concept of I am a leader, as if it was a property that I have. Actually, leadership is a property of the role that I'm in, not a property of me as a human being. And so that's where it comes back to, for the world we're coming into, the biggest challenges that businesses and leaders are facing are adaptive challenges, not technical challenges. It means that there's a core role, in particular for human resources, in developing capacity in individuals to transform themselves, to change their mindsets, for individuals to develop their adaptive capacity. It means individuals developing their capacity to use transformational thinking so that they can create new options. Again, if you think of the car industry, the companies who were huge horse-drawn carriage building companies failed to make the transition because they just did not have ways of thinking about how the world was transforming that enabled them to innovate and create the options they needed to create to transform their business model. So for individuals, it's that combination of developing the mental capacity to think differently, to create new options, developing, secondly, the capacity to change your concept of who you are, your mindset of who am I, who are you, and what does it mean if you're leading 1 minute and I'm leading you the next minute. And then that extends on into creating cultures that are fundamentally psychologically safe, safe for people to run experiments, safe for people to fail. Because if you're going to have a culture that is an adaptive culture, fit for purpose for adaptive challenges, it's going to be like in the world of startup investment. 9 out of 10 startups fail to deliver what the investors expect. The 1 out of 10 is what makes the other 9 worthwhile. And the same is true for what's happening and needs to happen in organizations today. 9 out of 10 of the things that are tried will fall short, but they have to be tried to get to that one that pays off for all 10. If it's not psychologically safe in the culture to run experiments, to try things out, to fail 9 times that you can get to the 10th success, then the company as a whole is destined to fail, because it will not get to that 1 out of 10, or perhaps even 1 out of 20 that pays off for all of the rest. And where that goes on to is most of the focus is on the organization design, the structures, the processes, the technology, things that are relatively easy to grasp and measure. However, that's the least helpful lever to use in addressing the challenges that businesses are facing today. The most powerful lever is transforming the overall business context. And that's something that, as we've said, focuses on adaptive capacity, which is much, much harder to measure, much, much harder to train for. It's building capacity, not skills. There's something else that I'll mention. There's a lot of talk at the moment about resilience. And I find resilience is a helpful halfway point, but for many of the adaptive challenges that business is facing, it doesn't go far enough. What we need is beyond resilience. We need the anti-fragility that Nassim Taleb refers to. And the difference is resilience means that you're strong enough not to break when some stress comes your way, when some shock comes into the business. That isn't going to help you if the shock is a fundamental paradigm shift that requires a fundamentally different kind of strength. Whereas anti-fragility is much more like a living organism. It means that when stresses come in, you do bend a bit to the stress. But the way that you bend and flex and react to the stress enables you to grow your strength in response to that specific stress. So anti-fragility means that you mix together in the organization elements that are constantly weakening and killing off the organization, because those are the things you need to weaken and kill off the strong parts of your organization that are only strong for the past business paradigm and are becoming a handicap and a weakness for the future paradigm, so that you have the resources and the space to grow the new parts of the organization that nobody has ever imagined you might need, that are fit for purpose for the future. And in terms of reinventing organizations, that does mean things like we need ways of killing off the hierarchies of some organizations, exactly those hierarchies that made the organizations successful in the 80s and 90s and 2000s are exactly the things that are going to weaken and handicap those organizations as we move into the future, where we need, let's say, a flexible organization running on sociocracy. Right, I will pause at that point. Has that triggered any questions?
It has. It's triggered a few. I'm going to have to go back and run back through it in my mind to bring them all back up. But glad you mentioned a couple of points there. One of them that I wanted to bring up is something that came up last year quite often, is fearlessness. And I know that you've spoken in the past and we've spoken about the need for healthy conflict within organizations. And I want to bring that back into the conversation, because the need for fearlessness is something that I see becoming much more important. And what I mean by fearlessness is the ability to come to work, to speak your mind, to challenge, to adapt. So what I think is going to be most instructive is how the leaders of those organizations are going to firstly accept that things need to change, then to be fearless in their own state as a leader, as a person who's senior in the company, to try new things, to understand that the paradigm has shifted, and then cede some of that power to those in the organization, the younger hires or the people with maybe some different technical or adaptive skills, to help drive the organization forward. We know that the changes are coming, but we need that fearlessness as well. So what do you think the leaders of today, how would you suggest that they go about building that fearlessness first in their own capacity for work and then in the organization?
There are a lot of things for leaders to do to become more fearless. The starting point is to identify what is it that they're afraid of and why. So, for example, one of the fears that drives a number of people who are in management and leadership roles is a drive to achieve, which they measure in terms of their status. Very often they look at things like, what is my job title? How many people are reporting to me? Objective measures of power in the organization. Now, if a leader sees themselves as a better person because they have a certain title or because they have a certain power, if they get some of their self-esteem from their title and their power, then they are automatically going to be fearful of anything that they think might take away some of that status and power. And the kinds of transformations that we're talking about that are being imposed on businesses by the digital transformation and the other transformations of the business world are changing the whole space of where leaders can derive their self-esteem from. So the first step for any leader to become fearless is to really take a hard, cold look at what is my relationship to my leadership position. Do I need other people to see me as a leader in order to have self-esteem? And if the answer to that question is in any way yes, then the starting point is to figure out, what does it mean to me to be a leader rather than to have a role that has leadership aspects, and to then work with a coach to figure out, how do I change what it means to me to be a better match to how the world actually is? Because at the end of the day, my value as a person, my value to the business, doesn't depend on a title. There are some very successful companies. Visa, for example, in its early days, did not have any job titles. And they were an enormously successful business, in part precisely because they didn't have job titles. So that's the starting point. For leaders to become fearless is to really find out, what am I afraid of? What is the meaning that I am inventing about how the world works, who I need to be, that makes me fearful? And then to work with a coach to change how I attribute meaning to the world around me, to myself, and to other people. Until a leader has done that, they're not going to be able to cede power to people who are not formally in a leadership role at the moment. Anti-fragility, you could call it a synonym for fearlessness. I would more tend to say that fearlessness is one of the building blocks of anti-fragility. It's absolutely necessary that people are psychologically safe in the organization, that there is absolutely no need to be afraid. There are so many stories in the air industry of the past where the level of fear in the cockpit between the captain and the rest of the crew was such that junior people would see the captain doing something that was almost certain to cause the plane to crash and would not say anything, leading to planes crashing. And this has led the airline industry to put in a number of cultural and mindset changes to create a context of fearlessness, of psychological safety in the cabin, so that regardless of your position in the hierarchy, if you happen to be the person who sees a potential risk, you, in a sense, become the leader in that moment because you're the one who's seen the risk and the others haven't. And so it's a context-based leadership, not a person-based leadership. The person who sees the biggest risk becomes the leader. Now, one of the things that implies is that leadership then becomes something that is transitory. It's completely independent of the person, and status, self-esteem cannot come from being a leader. It can only come from doing good work in whatever role you're in at the point you're doing the work. The other thing that this whole conversation about fearlessness implies is the difference between courage and fearlessness. If you have a psychologically safe organization where people can show up at work in a state of fearlessness, there is absolutely no need for courage. Courage is only needed if you have fear and you keep going despite the fear. The problem for businesses about courage is that this puts all of the load on the individual to grow their courageous strength in a fearful culture. But that's completely missing the entire point of an organization. As Peter Drucker so clearly said, the whole point of an organization is to enable every individual to perform at their best, rather than to only enable the super people to perform and everybody else to be mediocre. And that means that it really is about creating an organizational context that is psychologically safe, where nobody, no matter how strong or weak their courage is, has any hesitation about surfacing any issue that needs to be surfaced, any risk that needs to be surfaced, where everyone, no matter how courageous or not they are, can go into conflict without any hesitation.
Let's say I'm an HR person in a large organization and I'm attending a seminar, a presentation such as this, and I'm hearing these words about fearlessness and reinventing and all of these large, seemingly distant terms. How do I then take this information to my management team in my organization and say, look, this is something that's worth investing time and effort and energy in? How do you get senior management to really engage and take this seriously?
A couple of thoughts that I have. The first thing I would recommend is get the data. Good management is data-based. And if you can come to senior management with some solid data, that speaks far louder than any opinion that you might come in with. So get the data, make it as solid as possible, where there are gaps in the data, be very clear that there's a gap in the data and start work on closing those gaps. Be very clear on the hypotheses you're making. What are the assumptions? And what kind of data can disprove those hypotheses? So that's the starting point. The second thing is, this again is an adaptive challenge, not a technical challenge. So the data is just the technical starting point. The much bigger thing is, if you're a relatively junior internal change agent trying to drive this kind of change, it's imperative that you work on developing your own adaptive capacity. So develop your capacity to use transformational thinking patterns so that you can create options for the business to move forwards that nobody else is able to see. I think it was Swift, who said, vision is the art of seeing what is hidden from other people. And the essence of that kind of vision is being able to use patterns of thinking that go beyond simple binary right, wrong, yes, no logic into post-logical thinking that can hold multiple contradictory concepts in your head simultaneously. So it's important to develop that capacity. And the final one is the capacity to change your idea of who you are. So, for example, you may be fearful of raising this topic with your senior management. We'll use that fear as information about your own mental models of how the world works and what kind of a person you need to be, and see if that information about your mental models is shedding light on where your mental models are not helpful to you, where they're actually flawed mental models because the world does not necessarily work that way. You may be able to get yourself to the point where you recognize that what you're afraid of is actually just a mirage, is perhaps, even if it's real, far smaller than you imagine, far less real than you imagine. So all of those things can come into it that can help you step into a point of possibly even fearlessness, or at least make it easier for you to step courageously into a conflict. The other thing that I'd put in is, and I find this with actually quite a number of my clients, most of what most people do is driven by fear, at least in part. And so if you're a change agent working to convince senior management that your proposal is worth pursuing, go into it recognizing that senior management is likely to be reacting from fear as well. For example, one of the managers that I'm working with, what has been enormously helpful to him in working with the president of the division that he reports into is recognizing that this person is recognizing when this person is reacting out of their own vulnerabilities, their own way of determining or attributing meaning to any situation. And by recognizing what triggers the other person has for his vulnerability, the guy that I'm working with is able to preemptively defend the other person's triggers so that the other person does not get fearful in the conversations. And this is a classic example of a junior person creating a context of fearlessness for his manager. by really understanding what is it that triggers fear in his manager and eliminating all of those triggers in advance. And that has transformed their conversations and has meant that the organizational changes that this person is bringing in are moving forwards smoothly now, whereas in the past they did not move forwards, simply because the junior person has created a context of fearlessness for the manager.
If I am attending your session at the Digital HR Summit and I want to get started right this minute, right now, on some of these adaptive changes that you're talking about, I want to maybe find a coach or find some resources online, or I'm motivated to get started. What are some of the immediate steps that you can take?
Well, the obvious one that I'll start with, and I would say this, is get into contact with ourselves, because creating adaptive organizations and running programs, which we call the Adaptive Way programs, to create adaptive capacity in individuals is our core business. And we're about to start a program precisely for consultants and change agents on how to use transformational thinking to innovate and create new options that nobody else can see. So that's the obvious one that I would start with. Other things that I would suggest is there are some very good books out there by Professor Edgar Schein that are well worth reading. There is a good book by Amy Edmondson on, I think it's called Creating a Fearless Culture at Work.
Fearless Organization, I believe.
Or Fearless Organization, yes. That book is well worth reading as well. Also, the book by Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy, An Everyone Culture. Those are well worth reading. Put any of these into practice in your organization and it will absolutely help. So those are some of the things. I can also recommend, if you want to look at sociocratic organization design, there's an online program starting around now, an academy run by Sociocracy for All, on different aspects of creating a sociocratic organization. Again, that's a program well worth doing. Yeah, those are the immediate thoughts that come to mind. There's actually a lot of stuff out there. You can download the draft version of the book I'm writing at the moment from our website. And there's a lot more material referenced in that and in the list of references and books at the end.
Thank you for taking the time to speak to me today. I always learn a lot more than I can ever provide myself to the conversation. So it's fascinating to hear your thoughts and insights on this topic. And I'm sure, so if there's any way people can get in touch with you, I know you've got your website and your details there, but just let the people know how they can get in touch.
Yes, exactly. So you can get in touch with me either through the website, www.evolute6.com, or alternately, you can email me, graham@evolute6.com.